The train's whistle pierced the Wyoming air like a cry of mourning as Clara Whitmore stepped onto the weathered platform of Silver Creek Station. 28 years old, clutching a carpet bag that held everything she owned, she had traveled 2,000 miles for love, only to discover that love apparently had standards she couldn't meet. The telegram had been clear. Too plain. Cannot proceed with arrangement. Do not seek me out. R. Hutchinson. Clara's hands trembled as she read those brutal words again, the paper worn soft from her desperate handling during the long journey west. She had sold her mother's wedding ring to afford the train ticket, burned her bridges in Boston, and followed a promise that had crumbled to ash before she'd even met the man who'd made it. The other passengers hurried past her, eager to embrace their own destinies. Clara stood frozen, a statue of abandonment in a traveling dress that had seen better days, watching the world move forward while hers had stopped entirely. 28 was old for a mail-order bride. She'd known that when she answered Hutchinson's advertisement, but his letters had been kind, speaking of loneliness and the need for companionship rather than youth and beauty. She should have known better. A small crowd had gathered near the station's general store, their whispers carrying on the desert wind like tumbleweeds of cruelty. Word traveled fast in frontier towns, especially news as delicious as a rejected mail-order bride. Clara kept her chin high, though each whispered word felt like a brand against her skin. Poor thing, she heard one woman murmur. Came all this way for nothing. Maybe she ain't what she claimed to be in her letters, suggested another voice. Hutchinson's got standards, a man added with a harsh laugh. Can't blame him for wanting a proper wife, not some old maid desperate enough to travel cross-country for a husband. The sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden platform, and Clara felt sweat gathering beneath her high collar despite the autumn season. Wyoming was nothing like the gentle Massachusetts countryside she'd left behind. Here, everything seemed harsher, more unforgiving, the land, the weather, and apparently the people. She watched a man in a fine suit emerge from the station house, his eyes scanning the remaining passengers with obvious distaste. Robert Hutchinson. Even without an introduction, she knew him by the pinched expression on his face and the way he deliberately avoided looking in her direction. He'd seen her, certainly. She was the only unaccompanied woman of marriageable age on the platform. But he'd already made his judgment. Clara Whitmore had come west seeking love and found only cruelty. But sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that never happened to you. And sometimes when you think you're completely alone, someone unexpected is watching, someone who will change everything. Clara Whitmore had faced rejection before, but never with an audience. The weight of their stares pressed against her shoulders like winter wind, cold and unforgiving. She adjusted her grip on her carpet bag and walked toward the hotel, each step a declaration that she would not crumble in public, no matter how shattered she felt inside. The Silver Creek Hotel was a two-story structure that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from its weathered facade like old skin, and the stairs creaked ominously under her boots. The desk clerk, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked her up and down with undisguised disdain. "How long you staying?" he asked, his tone suggesting he hoped the answer was not long. "I'm not certain yet," Clara replied, maintaining what dignity she could muster. "Well, it's 50 cents a night, payment in advance, and no visitors after 10 o'clock. Clara counted out the coins from her rapidly dwindling funds, each one representing another day further from home and closer to complete destitution. The room was small and spare, containing little more than a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto the main street where her shame had been so publicly displayed. She sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. 2,000 miles from home, with barely enough money for a week's lodging, no return ticket, and no prospects. The tears she'd been holding back finally came, hot and bitter as desert rain. A knock at her door interrupted her grief. Clara wiped her eyes hastily, expecting the desk clerk with some additional humiliation or demand for payment. Instead, she found a young woman about her own age, holding a covered basket that smelled of fresh bread and hope. "Miss Whitmore?" the woman asked softly. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I run the boarding house down the street." She paused, her eyes kind but direct. "I heard what happened at the station." Clara's cheeks burned with renewed shame. I suppose the whole town knows by now. Small towns got big mouths, Sarah agreed without condemnation. But they also got short memories, if you give them something else to talk about. She held out the basket. I brought you some supper. Figured you might not feel like facing the dining room downstairs. The kindness was so unexpected that Clara felt fresh tears threatening. That's very generous, but I can't impose. Ain't imposing when it's freely offered, Sarah interrupted gently. Besides, I got a proposition for you, if you're interested in hearing it. Clara invited Sarah inside, grateful for human compassion after a day of public humiliation. The basket contained not just bread, but cold chicken, cheese, and even a small jar of peach preserves. It was the first real kindness anyone had shown her since leaving Boston. You're wondering why I'm helping a stranger, Sarah observed, settling into the room's single chair while Clara sat on the bed. The thought had occurred to me. Sarah smiled, but there was steel beneath the warmth. Because I was you once. Not a mail-order bride, mind you, but a woman alone in a town that had already decided what I was worth. She paused, studying Clara with intelligent eyes. How much education you got? I taught school back in Massachusetts for 6 years. Can you cipher? Keep books? Of course. What about standing up to men who think they can push you around? Clara thought of the whispers on the platform, of Hutchinson's deliberate cruelty, of a lifetime of being told she wasn't quite enough. I'm learning. Sarah's smile became genuine. Good answer. Here's my proposition. I need help managing my boarding house. The books are a mess. The previous girl I had couldn't add 2 and 2, and I'm drowning in paperwork. You help me get organized, learn the business, and I'll give you room, board, and a small wage. Nothing fancy, but enough to get you back on your feet. Why would you take such a risk on someone you don't know? Clara asked, suspicious, despite her desperate need. Sarah's expression grew serious. Because women like us gotta stick together out here. This town's got exactly 3 kinds of men. Those who'll use you, those who'll ignore you, and those rare ones who'll actually see you as a person worth knowing. Problem is, it ain't always easy to tell which is which until it's too late. She stood, smoothing her practical gray dress. Think about it tonight, but don't think too long. There's already talk about you, and not all of it's sympathetic. Some folks think a rejected mail-order bride is fair game for other arrangements. You catch my meaning. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. You're saying I'm not safe here. I'm saying a woman alone ain't never completely safe anywhere, but especially not in a town where half the men think you're desperate enough to take whatever they offer. Sarah moved toward the door, then paused. There is one thing you should know, though, about the man whose letters you answered. Robert Hutchinson ain't what he seems, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Oh, he's got money and a fine house, but he's got a temper too, and a taste for controlling his household with more than just words. You ask me, that telegram saved you from something worse than humiliation? Clara's blood ran cold. She thought of the increasingly demanding tone of Hutchinson's later letters, the way he'd begun to include detailed instructions about how she should dress, what she should say, how she should behave. At the time, she'd attributed it to a man's natural desire for a proper wife. Now those same words took on a darker meaning. The woman before you, Sarah added quietly, the one who answered his advertisement 2 years ago? She lasted exactly 3 months before she disappeared in the middle of the night. Sheriff claims she just moved on, but she shrugged meaningfully. You think he hurt her? I think powerful men in small towns get away with a lot of things they shouldn't. Sarah opened the door, then looked back. Sometimes what looks like the worst thing that ever happened to you turns out to be the hand of Providence steering you away from something much worse. After Sarah left, Clara sat alone with her thoughts and the generous meal, trying to process everything that had happened. She'd come west looking for love and security, only to find herself stranded and alone. But maybe, just maybe, she'd also found something else. The first real friend she'd had in years, and the chance to build a life on her own terms rather than at the mercy of a man's whims. Tomorrow she would accept Sarah's offer, But first, she needed to face the man who had rejected her, and what she discovered would change everything she thought she knew about her situation. The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching Clara's mood as she prepared to face whatever came next. She had slept little, her mind churning with Sarah's warnings and her own uncertain future. But as she dressed in her best remaining outfit, a deep blue dress that brought out her eyes, she felt something she hadn't expected: determination. She would not slink out of town like a whipped dog. Before she accepted Sarah's offer, before she tried to build a new life, she would face Robert Hutchinson and demand an explanation. Not for his rejection, that was his right, but for his cruelty. The morning air was crisp as she walked down Silver Creek's main street, her spine straight and her chin lifted, despite the curious stares that followed her progress. Word had spread overnight, as Sarah had predicted, and she could feel the weight of judgment in every glance. Hutchinson's house stood at the end of Elm Street, a large Victorian structure that spoke of wealth and pretension. It was painted white with green trim, surrounded by a fence that seemed designed more to keep people out than to mark property lines. Clara stood at the front gate for a long moment, gathering her courage. The door was answered not by Hutchinson himself, but by a young Mexican woman, whose eyes were dark with fear and whose wrists bore the telltale bruises of restraint. She couldn't have been more than 18, and when she spoke, it was in whispered, broken English. "Senor Hutchinson, he is not receiving visitors." "Tell him Clara Whitmore is here," Clara said firmly. "He'll see me." The girl, for she was little more than a child, glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Please, señorita, you should go. It is not safe here." Before Clara could respond, Hutchinson himself appeared in the doorway. He was a man of medium height with thinning brown hair and cold gray eyes that appraised her with undisguised disdain. He wore an expensive suit and gold watch chain, every inch the successful businessman. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice as flat and unwelcoming as his expression. "I thought my telegram was quite clear." "Your telegram was clear," Clara replied, surprising herself with her steady tone. "Your reasoning was not." Hutchinson's lips curved in an unpleasant smile. "You want reasons? Very well. You're too old, too plain, and from your letters, too educated for your own good. I need a wife who'll bear me children and keep her mouth shut, not some spinster schoolmarm with ideas above her station." "I see," Clara said calmly, though inside her heart was racing. "And does your ideal wife also come with bruises, like your current household help?" Hutchinson's face darkened, and the young woman behind him made a small sound of distress. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Clara interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "I'm stating plainly that any woman who ends up in this house is in danger, and I'm thanking Providence that your shallow requirements saved me from a fate worse than rejection." The man's hand moved to his belt, and Clara saw the leather strap hanging there. Not for holding up his trousers. That was what suspenders were for. This was something else entirely. Something meant to enforce obedience through pain. "You'd better watch that educated tongue of yours," Hutchinson growled, stepping closer to the threshold. "You're a woman alone in this town now, with no protection and no prospects. It would be very easy for you to disappear. The lady won't be alone much longer." The voice came from behind Clara, deep and steady with a hint of controlled anger. She turned to see a tall man in worn but well-maintained clothes, his hat tilted at an angle that shadowed his face. But she could see enough to know he was handsome in the weathered way of men who worked under the sun, with dark hair and eyes like chips of flint. "Afternoon, Hutchinson," the stranger continued, moving to stand beside Clara, with an easy confidence that spoke of a man comfortable with confrontation. "Thought you might want to know that Miss Whitmore here has accepted a position at the Mitchell boarding house. Seems she's got quite a head for business." Hutchinson's expression shifted from anger to calculation. "And you are?" "Jake Morrison. I run cattle south of town." He touched the brim of his hat politely to Clara. "Ma'am, I hope Mr. Hutchinson here has been treating you with the respect you deserve." Clara felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. This man, Jake Morrison, was defending her honor to a virtual stranger, standing up to a man with wealth and influence on behalf of a woman he didn't even know. Mr. Morrison, she said carefully, that's very kind of you, but I can handle my own affairs. Jake's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, suggesting a suppressed smile. I'm sure you can, ma'am. Just wanted to make sure everyone in town understands that you're not as alone as some folks might think. Hutchinson looked between them, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. How touching. The rejected mail-order bride has found herself a protector. His smile was cruel. Enjoy your charity, Miss Whitmore. In a town like this, it never lasts long. He stepped back and slammed the door, but not before Clara saw the young Mexican woman's face one last time. The girl's eyes were wide with something between hope and terror, and Clara knew she couldn't simply walk away. That girl inside, she said quietly to Jake as they walked back down the street. She's not there by choice. I figured as much, Jake replied, his voice grim. Hutchinson's had a string of housekeepers over the years. Young ones. They don't usually stay long, and when they leave, they don't say goodbye to anyone. Clara felt sick. And nobody does anything about it. Hard to do anything when the man owns half the town and the sheriff's on his payroll. Jake paused, studying her with those intense dark eyes. Unless someone was willing to make it their business. Someone with nothing left to lose. They walked in silence for several minutes, Clara acutely aware of the solid presence beside her and the curious stares from townspeople who weren't accustomed to seeing strangers together, especially when one of them had just publicly challenged Robert Hutchinson. Mr. Morrison, Clara finally said, I should thank you for your intervention, but I have to ask, why? You don't know me, and you've just made an enemy of an influential man. Jake stopped walking and turned to face her fully. In the daylight, she could see that his eyes were actually brown with flecks of gold, and that his face bore the lines of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. There was something else in his expression too, a sadness that seemed to run deeper than mere sympathy for a stranger's plight. Let's just say, I know what it's like to be judged by people who don't know the first thing about who you really are, he said quietly. And I don't much care for men who use their power to hurt women. Clara sensed there was more to the story, but before she could pursue it, Sarah Mitchell appeared at her elbow, slightly out of breath as if she'd been hurrying. Clara, there you are. I was worried when Mrs. Henderson said she saw you heading toward Elm Street. Sarah's gaze moved to Jake, and her expression grew wary. Mr. Morrison? Mrs. Mitchell, Jake replied with a polite nod. I was just making sure Miss Whitmore got back safely from her conversation with Mr. Hutchinson. The tension between Sarah and Jake was palpable, and Clara could sense there was a history here she didn't understand. But she also sensed that both of these people had her best interests at heart, even if they disagreed about what those interests might be. Sarah's boarding house was a warm, welcoming contrast to the cold Victorian mansion Clara had just left behind. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, and the smell of baking bread filled the air like an embrace. As they settled in the cozy kitchen over cups of strong coffee, Clara noticed how Sarah kept glancing toward the windows, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. You seem nervous, Clara observed. I am nervous, Sarah admitted. Jake Morrison's a good man, but he's also trouble. And after what happened this morning, Hutchinson's going to be looking for ways to strike back. Clara set down her cup, studying her new friend's face. What aren't you telling me about Mr. Morrison? And don't say it's nothing. I can see it in your eyes. Sarah sighed, suddenly looking older than her years. Jake's story ain't mine to tell, but I suppose you got a right to know what you're getting mixed up in. She paused, choosing her words carefully. 3 years ago, Jake was married to the prettiest girl in the county. Sweet thing named Ellen, barely 19 years old. Ellen Morrison was everything a frontier wife was supposed to be, Sarah continued. Beautiful, obedient, eager to please. She adored Jake, and he worshipped the ground she walked on. They had a little cabin about 5 miles south of town, near the creek where Jake runs his cattle. Clara found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite herself. What happened to her? She died, Sarah said quietly, but not the way you might think. See, Ellen had caught the eye of someone else, someone powerful, someone who wasn't used to being told no. The implication hit Clara like a physical blow. Hutchinson, Sarah nodded grimly. Started out innocent enough. Little compliments when she came to town. Offers to help with shopping, to drive her home when Jake was busy with the herd. Ellen was naive. She thought he was just being friendly. By the time she realized what he really wanted, it was too late. Clara's stomach churned. He forced himself on her. Worse, he convinced the whole town that she was willing, that she was carrying on behind her husband's back. Jake knew it wasn't true, but Sarah shook her head. Small towns love their scandals, especially when they involve a beautiful woman and a wealthy man. The whispers got so bad that Ellen couldn't show her face without being called names. She started staying home, stopped going to church, stopped talking to her friends. One morning, Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper, Jake found her in their bedroom. She'd taken his rifle and ended her shame the only way she thought she could. Left a note saying she couldn't bear to have people thinking she was unfaithful to the man she loved. Clara's eyes filled with tears for a woman she'd never met. My God. Jake went a little crazy after that. Started drinking, stopped taking care of himself or his ranch. Probably would have drunk himself to death if his foreman hadn't threatened to quit and take the whole crew with him. Sarah wiped her own eyes with the corner of her apron. Hutchinson, meanwhile, acted all sorrowful at the funeral. Talked about what a tragedy it was, how Ellen had been troubled and needed understanding. And no one suspected the truth? Oh, some folks suspected, but suspecting ain't proving, and Hutchinson's got money and lawyers. Jake's just a rancher with a few hundred head of cattle and a broken heart. Sarah met Clara's eyes directly. That's why he helped you today. He sees Ellen in every woman Hutchinson sets his sights on. That evening, as Clara worked on organizing Sarah's chaotic bookkeeping system, she found her thoughts returning again and again to Jake Morrison and his tragic wife. She understood now why he'd looked so sad, why he'd been willing to make an enemy of Hutchinson on behalf of a stranger. But she also understood that his protection came with a price. It made her a target. A soft knock at the boarding house's front door interrupted her calculations. Sarah answered it, and Clara heard a familiar, deep voice asking to speak with Miss Whitmore. Her pulse quickened as Sarah showed Jake into the small parlor where Clara had spread her work across a worn wooden table. Ma'am, Jake said, removing his hat and turning it nervously in his hands. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, Clara replied, though her heart was beating faster than it should have been. Please sit down. Would you like some coffee? That's kind of you, but I can't stay long. Jake settled into a chair across from her, and Clara noticed how his presence seemed to fill the small room. I wanted to apologize for this morning. I had no right to speak for you the way I did. Clara studied his weathered face, seeing the genuine regret there. You had every right to be a decent human being, Mr. Morrison, which is more than I can say for most people in this town. Still, I may have made things harder for you. Hutchinson's not the kind of man who forgets a slight. Sarah told me about your wife, Clara said quietly. I'm sorry for your loss. Jake's hand stilled on his hat brim, and for a moment Clara thought she'd made a terrible mistake by bringing up such a painful subject. But when he looked up, his eyes held gratitude rather than anger. Ellen would have liked you, he said simply. She had that same way of speaking her mind, no matter who it might offend. A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. Used to drive me crazy sometimes, the way she'd tell the preacher exactly what she thought of his sermon, or correct the schoolmaster when he got his facts wrong about the war between the states. She sounds like she was quite a woman. She was. Too good for this world, maybe. Too trusting. His expression grew serious again. Which brings me to why I'm really here, Miss Whitmore. I heard through the grapevine that you visited Hutchinson's house today. Did you see anything unusual? Clara thought of the young Mexican woman with the frightened eyes and bruised wrists. There's a girl there, very young. She's being held against her will. Jake's jaw tightened. I was afraid of that. Her name's Rosa Delgado. She disappeared from the Mexican settlement about 2 months ago. Her family's been looking for her, but he shrugged helplessly. They're afraid to accuse a man like Hutchinson without proof. What kind of proof would they need? The kind that's hard to get when the girl's trapped in that house and too scared to speak. Jake leaned forward, his eyes intense. But maybe if someone could get close to her, gain her trust. Someone like me, Clara finished. I can't ask you to do that, Jake said quickly. It's too dangerous. If Hutchinson suspected you were trying to help her, he'd do what? Reject me again? Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mr. Morrison, I came to this town with nothing to lose. I'm still in that same position. At least this way, I might be able to do some good before I disappear into the life of a spinster bookkeeper. Jake stared at her for a long moment, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. You're serious about this? Dead serious. That girl doesn't deserve to suffer just because she's powerless and poor. And Hutchinson doesn't deserve to keep getting away with destroying lives. It won't be easy or safe. Nothing worthwhile ever is. Clara stood up, suddenly feeling more alive than she had since stepping off that train. What do you need me to do? Jake rose as well, and for a moment they stood close enough that Clara could smell the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. First, we need to find a way to get you back into that house without raising suspicion. I may have an idea about that, Clara said thoughtfully, but it's going to require me to do something that goes against every instinct I have. What's that? Clara's smile was sharp as a blade. I'm going to have to make Robert Hutchinson think he's won. Clara's plan was as simple as it was terrifying. She would return to Hutchinson's house the following evening and apologize. She would tell him that her friend Sarah had convinced her she'd been foolish to expect love from a mail-order arrangement, and that she was prepared to accept whatever terms he might offer, as a housekeeper, if not as a wife. You're out of your mind, Sarah said flatly when Clara explained her strategy. That man is dangerous. He'll see right through you. Not if I play it right, Clara replied with more confidence than she felt. Men like Hutchinson have enormous egos. He'll want to believe that I've come crawling back, begging for his favor. It'll feed his sense of power. Jake, who had listened to the plan in grim silence, finally spoke. And once you're inside, what then? You can't just walk Rosa out the front door. Clara had spent most of the night thinking about that problem. There has to be a time when she's alone, or nearly alone. Maybe when Hutchinson's asleep, or when he's occupied with business. I need to get close enough to talk to her, to find out what her situation really is. And if he catches you, then at least we'll know for certain what kind of monster we're dealing with. Clara met Jake's concerned gaze steadily. Sometimes the only way to expose evil is to get close enough to document it. The next morning, Clara spent an hour at Sarah's kitchen table, carefully composing a letter that would make Robert Hutchinson believe he had broken her spirit. Every word was chosen to appeal to his arrogance, every phrase designed to make him feel superior and in control. Mr. Hutchinson, she wrote, after much reflection, I realize I may have been hasty in my response yesterday. A friend has helped me understand that perhaps I have been too proud, expecting more from our arrangement than was reasonable. If you would be willing to overlook my earlier rudeness, I would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss what role I might play in your household, even if not as the wife I had hoped to be. She signed it simply Clara Whitmore and asked Sarah's teenage nephew to deliver it personally. You sure about this? Sarah asked for the 100th time as they watched the boy ride toward town. No, Clara admitted, but I'm sure about what will happen to Rosa if no one helps her, and I'm sure that I can't live with myself if I don't try. Hutchinson's reply came within 2 hours, delivered by the same nervous boy who seemed eager to be rid of his commission. The note was brief and commanding. Miss Whitmore, come to my house at 7 this evening. Use the servant's entrance at the rear. Tell no one. Arisha Clara read it twice, her stomach churning with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The tone was exactly what she'd hoped for. Arrogant, controlling, designed to humiliate. But it also meant her plan was working. Hutchinson believed she was desperate enough to accept any scraps he might throw her. The servant's entrance, Jake said grimly when she showed him the note. He's already making it clear that you're not a guest. Good. That means I'll be more likely to encounter Rosa. Clara folded the note carefully. What time does he usually go to bed? Late. He's got business interests that keep him up past midnight most nights. But Clara... Jake caught her arm gently as she turned to go. If anything feels wrong, if you sense any danger at all, you get out of there immediately. Rose is not worth your life. Clara looked down at his hand on her arm, feeling the warmth of his touch through the fabric of her sleeve. How do you know she's not? How do any of us know what we're worth until we're tested? At 6:45, Clara stood at the rear of Hutchinson's property, her heart hammering against her ribs. The servant's entrance was a plain wooden door set into the back wall of the house, illuminated by a single lantern that cast dancing shadows on the ground. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, her plainest dress, her hair pulled back severely, her manner as humble as she could make it. The door opened before she could knock, revealing Robert Hutchinson himself. He was dressed in an expensive smoking jacket and held a glass of what looked like brandy. His eyes moved over her appraisingly, and she had to suppress a shudder at the cold calculation in his gaze. Miss Whitmore, how appropriate that you should come to the servants' entrance. I thought it was what you wanted, Clara replied, keeping her eyes downcast. Indeed it is. Come in. She followed him through a narrow hallway that led to what appeared to be his private study. The room was appointed with heavy furniture and expensive ornaments, but it felt cold despite the fire burning in the grate. Hutchinson gestured for her to sit in a straight-back chair, while he settled behind his desk like a judge preparing to pass sentence. So, he said, swirling the brandy in his glass, you've had time to reconsider your circumstances. Yes, sir. And you've realized that pride is a luxury a woman in your position can't afford. Clara forced herself to nod. Yes, sir. Excellent. Hutchinson's smile was predatory. Then let me be perfectly clear about what I'm offering. You will work as a housekeeper in this establishment. You will maintain absolute discretion about anything you see or hear. You will ask no questions and make no friendships among the other staff. In return, you will receive room, board, and a small wage. Other staff? Clara asked carefully. I maintain a household that serves various purposes, Miss Whitmore. Some of my employees are here voluntarily. Others, he shrugged. Let's just say they're working off debts to society. Clara's blood ran cold. He was talking about Rosa and possibly others. I understand. Do you? Hutchinson leaned forward, his eyes glittering dangerously. Because once you accept this position, leaving becomes complicated. I have a reputation to maintain, and I can't have former employees spreading gossip about my private affairs. The threat was unmistakable. Clara nodded again, playing her part. I won't cause any trouble, Mr. Hutchinson. I just need a place to work and earn my keep. Splendid. He stood and pulled a cord beside his desk. Within moments, the young Mexican woman Clara had seen before appeared in the doorway. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Clara, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. Rosa, Hutchinson said sharply, show Miss Whitmore to the small room on the 3rd floor. She'll be starting work immediately. As Clara followed Rosa through the dark corridors of Hutchinson's house, she realized she was walking into something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The house felt like a trap, and she was about to become its newest prisoner. The 3rd floor of Hutchinson's house felt like a different world from the opulent rooms below. The corridors were narrow and dimly lit, with plain wooden floors that creaked with every step. The air smelled of fear and desperation, emotions so thick Clara could almost taste them. Rosa moved silently ahead of her, carrying a single candle to light their way. The girl hadn't spoken a word since leaving Hutchinson's study, but Clara could see the tension in her rigid shoulders and careful steps. When they reached a small door at the end of the hallway, Rosa finally turned to face her. This is your room, she whispered, her English heavily accented but clear. Do not make noise after dark. Do not leave this floor without permission. Do not trust anyone. Clara stepped into the tiny chamber, which contained nothing but a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window so high she would need to stand on the bed to look out. Rosa started to leave, but Clara caught her arm gently. Wait, she whispered. I know why you're here. I know you didn't come willingly. Rosa's eyes widened with terror, and she pulled away as if Clara's touch burned her. You know nothing, she hissed. Say nothing. He hears everything. Before Rosa could flee, another door opened along the hallway, and a second young woman emerged. This one was blonde and pale, probably not much older than Rosa, but her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much suffering. She wore a simple gray dress that hung loosely on her thin frame. "Rosa?" the blonde woman called softly. "Is everything all right?" "New girl," Rosa replied tersely. "Go back to your room, Emma." But Emma was already moving toward them, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. When she saw Clara, her expression grew curious, despite the caution in her eyes. "You're the mail-order bride," Emma said. "The one who was rejected." Clara nodded. "And you are?" "Emma Sheffield, from Missouri originally." Emma glanced nervously toward the stairs. "How long has he given you to decide?" "Decide what?" Emma and Rosa exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "Whether you'll cooperate," Emma explained quietly, "or whether you'll need encouragement." The words sent ice through Clara's veins. "How many of you are there?" "4, counting you now," Rosa answered reluctantly. "Sometimes more, sometimes less. Girls disappear when they cause too much trouble." "Where do they go?" Neither girl answered, but the terror in their eyes told Clara everything she needed to know. A third door creaked open, and another girl emerged. This one couldn't have been more than 15, with auburn hair and freckles that made her look even younger. She moved carefully as if in pain, and Clara noticed the way she favored her left side. "Is it safe to come out?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Lily," Emma said sadly. "She's only been here a month." Clara's heart broke, looking at the child. For that's what she was, a child who should have been playing with dolls and learning her letters, not trapped in this house of horrors. "How did you come to be here?" she asked gently. Lily's eyes filled with tears. "I was traveling with my aunt to Denver. Our wagon broke down near town, and this nice man offered to help us. He said he had a place we could stay while the wheel was being fixed." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "My aunt. She tried to protect me when she realized what kind of place this was. They took her away 3 days ago, and I haven't seen her since." Clara felt rage building in her chest, white hot and consuming. These weren't just vulnerable women being exploited. There were children here too. The full scope of Hutchinson's evil was becoming clear, and it was worse than anything she had imagined. "Listen to me, all of you," Clara said, her voice low but fierce. "I'm going to get us out of here. All of us." Rosa shook her head violently. "You cannot. He has men watching. He has agreements with people in town. Even if we escaped, where would we go? Who would believe us?" "I know someone who will believe us," Clara replied, thinking of Jake waiting somewhere out in the darkness. "Someone who's been looking for proof of what goes on in this house." Emma's eyes flickered with something that might have been hope. "You really think we could escape?" "I don't think it. I know it. But we have to be smart about this. We have to work together." That night, Clara lay awake on the narrow bed, her mind racing as she tried to process what she had learned. This wasn't just a case of one man abusing his power over vulnerable women. This was something far more sinister, a systematic operation that lured or kidnapped young women and children and held them prisoner. Near midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside her door, followed by the unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock. Her blood ran cold as she realized the truth. The doors locked from the outside. They weren't employees in this house. They were prisoners. A few minutes later, she heard voices drifting up from below. One was clearly Hutchinson's, but there were others. Men's voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. Clara crept to her door and pressed her ear against the wood, straining to hear. "The new shipment from Denver arrives tomorrow," Hutchinson was saying. "Make sure the basement cells are ready. We'll need to process them quickly. The buyers are getting impatient." "What about the new one upstairs?" another voice asked. "The school teacher. She's got that stubborn look about her. Might need extra breaking in." Clara's stomach churned, but she forced herself to keep listening. "Give her a few more days," Hutchinson replied. "Let her see what happens to girls who don't cooperate. Once she watches Emma take her first customer tomorrow night, she'll be more amenable to suggestion." Clara's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. They were planning to use Emma as an example, to force Clara to witness whatever horrors they inflicted on the other girls. The casual way they discussed these atrocities, as if they were talking about breaking horses or training dogs, made her physically ill. "And the Mexican girl?" a third voice asked. "She's been here too long. starting to cost more than she's worth. Rosa's family has stopped looking for her. That makes her less valuable, but also less dangerous. We'll keep her for the local trade. The miners don't care much about looks as long as the price is right. Clara's hands shook as the full horror of her situation became clear. Hutchinson wasn't just abusing vulnerable women, he was selling them. The debts to society he had mentioned weren't legal obligations. They were fabricated justifications for slavery and prostitution. She thought of Jake, waiting somewhere out in the darkness, probably expecting her to return with information about Rosa's situation. He had no idea that she was now trapped in the same web, or that the situation was far more dangerous than either of them had imagined. The voices below continued their casual discussion of human lives as if they were talking about livestock, and Clara felt a rage building in her chest that threatened to burn away her fear. These men had destroyed Ellen Morrison's reputation and driven her to suicide. They were holding Rosa and Emma and Lily, and God knew how many others as prisoners, and now they planned to do the same to her. But Clara Whitmore was not Ellen Morrison, and she was not the frightened, desperate woman who had stepped off the train just days before. She had been tested by rejection and humiliation, and she had not broken. She would not break now. Moving as quietly as possible, she began to examine her tiny prison. The window was too high and too small for escape, but it might be possible to signal someone outside. The walls were thin enough that she could hear voices from other rooms, which meant sound traveled both ways. And the floor. Clara knelt and ran her hands over the wooden planks, feeling for loose boards or weak spots. Near the far corner, she found what she was looking for, a section where the wood gave slightly under pressure. With enough time and careful work, she might be able to create an opening large enough for a person to squeeze through. But even as she worked quietly at the loose board, Clara knew that escape wasn't her primary goal. These men were planning to bring more victims to this house tomorrow. More young women who would disappear into this nightmare of exploitation and abuse. She couldn't save herself and leave them to that fate. The voices below were growing louder, and Clara could make out more of their conversation. They were discussing logistics, how to transport the new arrivals without being seen, which customers were expecting deliveries, how much each girl would bring at auction. The railroad man wants another young one, Hutchinson was saying, preferably blonde. He's got specific tastes. What about the banker's wife? Another voice asked. She's been asking questions about the girls who've gone missing from the orphanage. Mrs. Henderson's a problem, Hutchinson agreed, but she's also a solution. Rich widow, lives alone, asks too many questions. She'd bring top dollar from the right buyer. Clara's blood ran cold. They were talking about kidnapping one of the town's most respected citizens. Mrs. Henderson had been kind to her at the general store, had even defended her against some of the crueler gossip. The thought of that dignified woman ending up in a place like this was unbearable. And then she heard her own name. The schoolmarm will bring a good price once she's broken in properly, Hutchinson was saying. Educated women are always in demand, especially if they're still intact. How do you know she is? Hutchinson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Look at her. 30 years old, desperate enough to travel across the country for a husband she'd never met. No man's ever wanted her enough to claim her. She's exactly what some of our clients are looking for. Experienced enough to be interesting, but not so used that she's lost her appeal. Clara pressed her fist against her mouth to keep from making any sound that might give her away. The casual cruelty of their words was like physical blows, but it also crystallized her resolve. She would not be another victim of their trafficking operation, and she would not leave this house without Rosa and Emma and Lily. The meeting below seemed to be breaking up, with chairs scraping against the floor and boots moving toward the door. Clara quickly returned to her bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin and closing her eyes. She heard Hutchinson's voice in the hallway, giving orders to someone about guard rotations and security measures. When silence finally returned to the house, Clara lay still for another hour, making sure everyone had settled for the night. Then she crept back to the loose floorboard and began working at it again, using a metal stay from her corset to pry at the edges. The work was slow and painstaking, but gradually the board began to give way. A new sound reached her ears, a soft tapping at her window. Clara's heart leaped as she realized someone was outside. 3 stories up. There was only one person it could be. Jake had come for her. Clara climbed onto her narrow bed and pressed her face to the small window. In the moonlight, she could just make out a figure clinging to a rope that had been anchored somewhere above. Jake's face appeared at the glass, his expression grim with determination and relief when he saw her. She worked frantically at the painted window latch, her fingers slipping on the old metal. When it finally gave way, Jake squeezed through the narrow opening with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. "Thank God you're all right," he whispered, gathering her into his arms for a brief, fierce embrace. "When you didn't come back, I started imagining the worst." "The worst is exactly what's happening here," Clara replied, her voice shaking with emotion. "Jake, this isn't just about Rosa. It's so much worse than we thought." As quickly and quietly as she could, Clara told him everything she had learned, about Emma and Lily, about the trafficking operation, about the new shipment of victims arriving tomorrow, about Hutchinson's plans for Mrs. Henderson. Jake's expression grew darker with each revelation. "We need to get you out of here now," he said when she finished. "I'll come back for the others with help." "No." Clara's voice was firm despite its whisper. "We don't leave anyone behind. These girls don't have time for a second rescue attempt. I heard them talking about moving everyone out of town within the week. And there are more coming tomorrow who'll walk straight into this trap." Jake stared at her for a long moment, and Clara saw the exact moment when he realized she was absolutely serious. "Clara, you don't understand what you're asking. There are at least 5 armed men in this house, plus however many arrive with the new shipment tomorrow. I'm just one person with a rope and a rifle. Then we'd better be smart about this." Clara moved to her door and listened carefully. The voices from below had stopped, which meant the meeting was over. "How many ways out of this house are there?" "Front door, back door, and a root cellar entrance on the north side. But all of them will be guarded now, especially after what happened tonight." Clara thought quickly. "What about the stable?" "There has to be a way to get from the house to the horses without going outside." Jake's eyes lit with understanding. "The tunnel. I'd forgotten about that." He moved to the window and looked out toward the property's outbuildings. Hutchinson had a tunnel built between the house and the stable during the Indian troubles. It comes up through the floor of the tack room. "Can we get to it from here?" "Maybe, but first we need to gather the other girls without alerting anyone." Jake pulled a second rope from the coil around his waist. "Can you climb?" Clara looked at the thin rope dubiously. "I'm about to find out." "There's something else," Jake said, his voice grim. "I brought help, but not as much as I'd hoped. The sheriff's in Hutchinson's pocket, and half the town council owes him money. But I found 3 good men who are willing to stand up to him. Tom Bradley from the livery, Frank Morrison, no relation, who runs the freight company, and Doc Patterson. They're waiting in the woods about a quarter-mile from here." Clara felt a surge of hope. "That's not very many against Hutchinson's men." "No, but it might be enough if we're smart about it. The key is to get all the girls out at once, so they can't use them as hostages." Jake checked his pocket watch in the moonlight. "It's almost 2 in the morning. If we're going to do this, we need to move now, while most of the guards are asleep." Clara nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. "Let's go get them." Moving with painful slowness, Clara and Jake crept along the third-floor hallway, stopping at each door to listen for sounds of life within. The old house seemed to breathe around them, every creak of the floorboards echoing like gunshots in the tense silence. They found Emma first, curled up on a bed similar to Clara's, her eyes wide with terror when they shook her awake. For a moment, Clara thought the girl might scream, but Emma's survival instincts kicked in, and she pressed her hand over her own mouth. "Who is he?" Emma whispered, staring at Jake with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Someone who's going to help us get out of here," Clara assured her. "Can you climb a rope?" Emma nodded eagerly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I grew up on a farm. I can climb anything." "Good. We're going to go get the others, and then we're all leaving together." Rosa's room was 2 doors down, but when they tried the handle, they found it locked. Jake pulled out a thin piece of metal and worked at the mechanism, his movements quick and efficient despite the tension. The lock clicked open after what felt like an eternity, and they found Rosa sitting on her bed, fully dressed as if she'd been expecting them. I heard whispers in the hallway, she explained quietly. I have been waiting for someone to come for me since the day they brought me here. There's another girl, Clara said. Lily, where would her room be? Next to mine, Rosa replied, pointing to the adjacent door. But she may be downstairs. Sometimes he... She shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. Jake's jaw tightened, but he simply nodded. We'll check her room first, then search the house if we have to. No one gets left behind. Lily's room was unlocked, and they found her huddled under a thin blanket, awake but trembling. When she saw them, her eyes filled with tears of relief. Are we really leaving? She whispered. All of us, Clara promised, helping the girl to her feet. But we have to be very quiet and very brave. Can you do that? Lily nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Despite everything she'd endured, there was still fight left in her, the kind of stubborn courage that Clara recognized in herself. There's something else, Rosa said urgently. There are 3 more girls in the basement. They came last week, but they fought too much, so he put them down there to teach them respect. Jake cursed under his breath. The basement's directly below Hutchinson's study. There's no way to reach it without being seen? Then we make sure he's not there to see us, Clara said grimly. What's the layout down there? Kitchen, pantry, root cellar, Jake replied. The stairs to the basement are behind the kitchen. But Clara, there are at least 2 guards on the main floor at all times. Clara thought quickly. What if we created a distraction? Something to draw them away from the house? Like what? An idea began forming in Clara's mind. Dangerous, but it might work. The stable. If there was a fire in the stable, they'd all run to save the horses, wouldn't they? Horses are valuable. They might even wake Hutchinson. Jake's eyes widened as he understood what she was suggesting. That could work. The tunnel entrance is in the tack room. If we set a fire in the hayloft, it would spread slowly enough to give us time to get everyone through the tunnel before the whole building goes up. But someone would have to set the fire and get back to the house before the guards investigate, Emma pointed out. I'll do it, Jake said immediately. No. Clara's voice was firm. You're the only one who knows where the tunnel entrance is. If something happens to you, we're all trapped. She met his eyes steadily. I know horses and I know fires. I can set it and get back. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. Everything we're doing is dangerous, Clara replied. But this is our best chance. You know I'm right. Before Jake could argue further, they heard footsteps on the stairs below, someone making rounds. They quickly helped the girls climb out through Clara's window, with Jake going first to help them down the rope to the ground. Clara was about to follow when she heard the footsteps getting closer. Go, she whispered urgently to Jake. Get them to safety. I'll set the fire and meet you at the tunnel entrance. I'm not leaving you. You have to. If he finds us all together, we're all dead. Clara pushed him toward the window. I know this house now. I can get to the basement and meet you at the stable. Jake's expression was agonized, but he knew she was right. The tunnel entrance is behind the feed bins in the tack room. If I'm not there, you will be. Clara squeezed his hand briefly. Now go. Take care of them. She watched him disappear through the window just as the footsteps reached the 3rd floor. Clara quickly closed the window and threw herself onto the bed, feigning sleep as the key turned in her lock. But instead of Hutchinson, it was one of his men, a thin, weaselly-looking fellow with bad teeth and worse intentions. He carried a lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls as he peered into her room. Thought I heard something up here, he muttered, looking around suspiciously. Clara sat up slowly, blinking as if she'd just awakened. Is everything all right? I heard footsteps. The man studied her for a long moment, then seemed satisfied that she was genuinely confused. Go back to sleep, and remember, no noise after lights out. After he left, locking the door behind him, Clara waited for several minutes before springing into action. She had memorized the layout of the house during her brief time there, and she knew there was a back staircase that led from the servants' quarters to the kitchen. If she could reach it without being seen, she might be able to get to the basement and then slip out to the stable. Using the metal stay from her corset, Clara worked frantically at the loose floorboard she'd discovered earlier. It gave way with a soft crack, creating an opening just large enough for her to squeeze through. She found herself in the space between floors, cramped, dusty, and filled with the scurrying sounds of mice, but it would serve her purpose. Crawling carefully through the narrow space, Clara made her way toward the back of the house. She could hear voices from the rooms below, guards talking, someone walking around. But the kitchen area seemed quiet, and she could see a faint glimmer of light from what she hoped was the basement stairwell. She found another loose board and pried it up, lowering herself carefully into what turned out to be a pantry filled with barrels and sacks of grain. The door was slightly ajar, giving her a view of the kitchen beyond. A single guard sat at the table, his back to her, apparently dozing over a cup of coffee. Clara held her breath and slipped past him, making it to the basement stairs without being detected. The wooden steps creaked ominously under her weight, but the sound was masked by the guards snoring. The basement was even worse than she had imagined. 3 small cells lined one wall, each containing a young woman who looked up at Clara's approach with expressions of desperate hope. They were all younger than Clara, probably in their teens, and they bore the marks of recent abuse. "Who are you?" one of them whispered. "Someone who's getting you out of here," Clara replied, examining the locks on their cells. They were simple bolt mechanisms, designed to keep frightened girls in, rather than determined rescuers out. She slid the bolts back one by one, wincing at the soft metallic sounds they made. "Can you all walk?" she asked as the girls emerged from their cells. "I think so," the first girl replied, though she was clearly favoring her left leg. "Good. We're leaving now, but we have to be very quiet. There's a man upstairs who will hurt us if he hears us." Leading the 3 girls up the basement stairs, Clara peered cautiously into the kitchen. The guard was still asleep, but his breathing had changed. He might wake at any moment. Clara gestured for the girls to wait while she crept across the kitchen to the back door. It was locked, but the key hung on a nail beside the frame. Clara eased it into the lock and turned it slowly, praying it wouldn't make noise. The door opened with the softest of clicks, and cool night air rushed in. "Now," she whispered, and the 4 of them slipped out into the darkness. The stable was about 50 yards from the house, a large wooden structure that housed Hutchinson's considerable collection of horses. Clara could see light flickering in the tack room windows. Jake and the others were already there, waiting for her. "Stay close to me," she told the 3 girls. "When we get to the stable, there's going to be a tunnel that leads away from here. But first, I need to start a fire." Leading them around to the back of the stable, Clara found what she was looking for, a ladder that led to the hayloft. She climbed quickly, pulling herself up into the sweet-smelling darkness filled with bales of hay and straw. Working quickly, Clara arranged several bales near a lantern that had been left burning. She scattered loose straw around the area, creating a trail that would carry the fire slowly but surely throughout the loft. When she was satisfied with her preparations, she knocked over the lantern, letting the burning oil spread across the dry hay. The fire caught immediately, and Clara scrambled down the ladder as smoke began to fill the air above. She could already hear shouts from the house. Someone had seen the glow. "This way," she told the 3 girls, leading them toward the tack room where Jake was waiting with Rosa, Emma, and Lily. He had moved the feed bins aside, revealing a wooden trapdoor in the floor. "Thank God," he said when he saw her. "I was starting to think—" "No time," Clara interrupted as the shouting from the house grew louder. "They'll be here any minute." Jake pulled the trapdoor open, revealing a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "It's about 200 yards to the other end," he said. "Rosa, you go first with the lamp. Everyone else follow her. I'll bring up the rear." One by one, the girls descended into the tunnel. Clara was about to follow when she heard something that made her blood run cold. Hutchinson's voice, much closer than it should have been. "The fire's a distraction," he was shouting. "Check the house. Check the rooms." Clara looked at Jake, and they both realized the same thing at the same moment. Hutchinson was smarter than they'd given him credit for. He'd figured out their plan. "Go," Jake said urgently, pushing her toward the tunnel entrance. "I'll hold them off." "Not without you. Someone has to—" Before he could finish, the tack room door exploded inward, and Hutchinson himself stood there with 3 armed men behind him. His face was twisted with rage, and he held a rifle pointed directly at Clara's chest. "Well, well," he said. his voice deadly calm despite the chaos around them. "The school marm has been busy." Clara stepped protectively in front of the tunnel entrance, even though she knew it was probably too late. "Let them go, Hutchinson. Your quarrel is with me." "Oh, I intend to let them go," he replied with a cruel smile. "Right back to their rooms where they belong. And you, Miss Whitmore, are going to help me convince them to cooperate." That's when Clara heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at full gallop. Jake's reinforcements had arrived, and they were coming fast. The stable door burst open as 3 men on horseback charged in, scattering Hutchinson's men and creating enough chaos for Clara to grab Jake's hand and dive into the tunnel. Behind them, she could hear gunfire and shouting, but they were already moving through the narrow passage toward freedom. They emerged from the tunnel into a grove of cottonwood trees about a quarter-mile from the house. The girls were waiting there, huddled together but safe. In the distance, they could see flames consuming the stable and spreading to the main house. "It's over," Jake said, pulling Clara into his arms. "Hutchinson's finished." Clara looked back at the burning house where she had nearly lost everything, including her life. Tomorrow, the territorial authorities would find the evidence of Hutchinson's crimes in the ashes. The girls would be free to return to their families or build new lives wherever they chose. And Clara herself? Clara had found something she never expected in the darkness of that terrible place. The strength to fight not just for herself, but for others who couldn't fight for themselves. She had discovered that sometimes the most important battles weren't the ones you fought for your own survival, but the ones you fought for justice. As they made their way through the pre-dawn darkness toward the town where Sarah was waiting with warm beds and hot food, Clara felt a profound sense of completion. She had come to Silver Creek as a rejected mail-order bride, but she was leaving as something far more valuable, a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to fight for what was right. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the mountains as they reached Sarah's boarding house, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a beautiful day. "You stupid woman," Hutchinson snarled, trying to bring the gun to bear again. Clara grabbed his wrist with both hands, fighting for control of the weapon. She was smaller than him, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. The fire was spreading rapidly now, consuming the dry wooden floor and beginning to lick at the walls. "The whole house will burn," she gasped. "Everyone will die, including Mary in the basement." "Then we'll all burn together," Hutchinson replied through gritted teeth. But as the smoke began to thicken, Clara heard something that gave her new hope. Shouting from below, the sound of men running, the crash of doors being forced open. Jake hadn't gone far after all. He'd brought help. The sound of approaching footsteps gave Clara the strength she needed for one final effort. She drove her knee upward, catching Hutchinson in the ribs and causing him to loosen his grip on the revolver. Clara wrenched it away and rolled clear, coming up with the weapon pointed directly at his chest. "It's over," she said, coughing from the thickening smoke. Hutchinson looked at the gun, then at the fire spreading across the room, then back at her face. What he saw there made him realize that Clara Whitmore was no longer the desperate woman who had stepped off the train days earlier. This was someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. "Jake!" Clara called out as loudly as she could. "Third floor. I have Hutchinson." The response came immediately, boots pounding up the stairs, Jake's voice calling her name. When he burst into the room with 3 other men behind him, Clara had never been so happy to see anyone in her life. "Mary," she said urgently as Jake moved to secure Hutchinson, "there's another girl in the basement. We have to get her before the fire spreads." While 2 of Jake's companions took custody of Hutchinson, Clara and Jake fought their way through the smoke-filled house toward the basement. The fire was spreading rapidly, feeding on the old dry wood, but they could hear voices from below. Mary was alive, and she was calling for help. They found her chained to a wall in a small, windowless cell that reeked of fear and desperation. She was younger than the others, probably no more than 16, with hollow eyes and bruises that spoke of systematic abuse. "Please," she whispered when she saw them. "Please don't leave me." "We're getting you out of here," Clara promised, while Jake worked to break the chains with a crowbar he'd brought from the stable. "You're safe now." As they helped Mary up the basement stairs, Clara could see the full scope of Hutchinson's operation. There were other cells, other chains, evidence of more victims than she had ever imagined. But there was no time to document it all. The house was becoming an inferno, and they needed to escape before the ceiling collapsed. They made it outside just as the roof began to cave in, sending sparks and burning debris high into the night sky. Clara stood in the yard with Jake's coat around her shoulders, watching justice consume the house where so much evil had been done. In the days that followed, the full extent of Hutchinson's crimes came to light. Rosa's family came to Silver Creek to take their daughter home, weeping with joy to have her back alive. Emma chose to stay in town, accepting Sarah's offer of legitimate work at the boarding house. Mary, who had been taken from an orphanage in Colorado, was reunited with relatives who had been searching for her. Hutchinson himself was taken to the territorial capital to stand trial, though Clara doubted he would live long enough to see a courtroom. Men like him rarely survived in prison, especially when their crimes involved women and children. The town of Silver Creek, meanwhile, underwent its own transformation. The destruction of Hutchinson's operation sent shockwaves through the community, forcing people to confront how willingly they had ignored evil in their midst. Some left town in shame. Others stayed and worked to build something better. Clara found herself at the center of this renewal, her courage in exposing Hutchinson's crimes having earned her a respect she had never experienced. But more than that, she had found something she'd given up hoping for. 3 weeks after the fire, Clara sat on the porch of Sarah's boarding house, watching the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Silver Creek. The town was slowly healing, and so was she. The bruises from her fight with Hutchinson had faded, but more importantly, the deeper wounds of a lifetime of rejection and humiliation were finally beginning to heal. "Mind if I sit with you?" Jake's voice came from behind her, warm and familiar. Clara turned to see him standing at the foot of the porch steps, his hat in his hands and an expression of nervous hope on his weathered face. "I'd like that." He settled beside her on the wooden bench, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and sage that always seemed to cling to him. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I wanted to thank you," Jake said finally, "for what you did. For Rosa and Emma and Mary, and for Ellen, in a way. You gave them justice when the rest of us were too afraid to try." "We did it together," Clara replied. "I couldn't have saved anyone without your help." "Still," he turned to face her fully, "what you did took more courage than I've seen in most men. You walked into hell to save people you barely knew." Clara met his gaze, seeing something in his eyes that made her heart race. "I had good reason to. I knew what it felt like to be powerless, to be dismissed and discarded. I couldn't let it happen to them." Jake was quiet for a long moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "Clara, I know you came here looking for one thing and found something completely different. I know you've been hurt, and I know you have no reason to trust another man's promises." Clara's pulse quickened, but she remained silent, letting him find his words. "But these past few weeks, watching you work with Sarah, seeing how you've helped this town heal, I've come to realize something." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "I thought I could never care for anyone the way I cared for Ellen. I thought that part of me died with her. Jake, let me finish, please." His voice was gentle but determined. "You're not Ellen. You're stronger than she was, braver than she was. You're not looking for someone to protect you. You're looking for someone to stand beside you. And he took a deep breath. "I'd like to be that man, if you'll have me." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Jake Morrison, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to build a life with me, not because you need rescuing and not because I need taking care of, but because we're better together than we are apart." He smiled, and Clara saw that the sadness that had shadowed his eyes was finally beginning to lift. "What do you say, Miss Whitmore? Are you willing to take a chance on a broken-down rancher with more grief than good sense?" Clara laughed, the sound bright and free in the evening air. "Mr. Morrison, I think I stopped being Miss Whitmore the day I decided to fight back instead of giving up. And yes, I'll marry you. On one condition." "Name it." "We build a house with enough room for visitors, for women who need help, who need a place to heal and start over." This town needs to remember what we all learned from Hutchinson's crimes, that evil flourishes when good people choose to look away. Jake's smile widened until it threatened to split his face. Clara Morrison, you're going to be the finest ranch wife in Wyoming territory. 1 year later, Clara Morrison stood on the porch of her new home, watching her husband work with the horses in the corral below. The house was larger than she had ever dreamed of living in, with extra bedrooms that had already sheltered half a dozen women seeking fresh starts in the aftermath of personal tragedies. Emma had married a local merchant and now ran her own dress shop in town. Rosa had returned to visit twice, bringing her new husband and baby daughter to meet the woman who had helped save her life. Mary was attending a school for young women in Denver, her education funded by the territorial government as compensation for her ordeal. And Clara herself? Clara had found something she had never expected to find in Silver Creek, Wyoming. A love built on mutual respect and shared purpose. A community that valued her strength rather than diminishing it, and a life that had meaning beyond her own survival. She touched the slight swell of her belly, where her and Jake's first child was growing, and smiled. When she had stepped off that train as a rejected mail-order bride, she had thought her life was over. Instead, it had been the beginning of everything she had never dared to hope for. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Clara Morrison, formerly Whitmore, counted herself the luckiest woman alive. Sometimes she reflected, the best love stories really did begin with rejection. If this story of courage, redemption, and unexpected love moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring tales from the American frontier. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced rejection that led to something better? Let us know. And remember, in the untamed West and in life, sometimes what looks like the end is really just the beginning of your greatest adventure.